Hi, everyone. I'm Steph, and that's Lisa. Together with Jenny, we are PD Connect, and we want to welcome Dr. Ray Dorsey. You need me to start over?
We gotta start over.
Oh, man. They call us the dynamic duo. It's more like the Tweedledee and Tweedledum. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph. That's Lisa. Together with Jenny, we're PD Connect. Thank you so much to Dr. Ray Dorsey for being here. I'm going to read his bio, and then we'll get the show on the road. All right. Okay, Dr. Ray Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology and Director of the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. Through creative use of technology, he and his colleagues seek to enable anyone, anywhere to receive care, participate in research, and benefit from therapeutic advances. His research has been published in leading medical, neurological, and economic journals and has been featured in National Public Radio, in the New York Times, and in the Wall Street Journal. In 2015, the White House recognized him as a champion for change for Parkinson's disease. Thank you so much for being here. And here is Ray, as he would like to be called. And there we go. You muted him.
Oh, shoot.
Okay,
all right.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you very much, Steph and Lisa, for that kind introduction. Delighted to be with you all today. I'm going to give you a 20-minute overview of the book that my colleagues, Dr. Michael Oken, Todd Sharon, Boss Bloom, and I wrote in March of 2020. That came out in March of 2020. But before, and I want to get, then there'll be plenty of time for questions. But before, I want to start with a question for you. So how many of you know why you have Parkinson's disease? If anyone, you can put in the chat or raise a hand. Does anyone know why they have Parkinson's disease? I'm going to submit to you, if you don't know why you have Parkinson's disease, we're never going to be able to prevent it, and we're never sufficiently prevent it, and never going to be able to treat it sufficiently well. You're not going to be able to protect your friends and family members from getting Parkinson's disease. So the first thing you should get when you disease is, why did I get this disease? And if we can't answer that question, we're not going to be able to prevent it, and we're not going to be adequately going to be able to treat it. And so today I'm going to give you some thoughts about why you might have Parkinson's disease. A lot of it will draw on content from the book, especially the first half of the book.
Can I interrupt, Ray? May I interrupt?
Yes, someone's speaking. Go ahead.
My name is Michael, and I have an idea why I got it, although I have to be careful from the point of legal things. But I've lived for 40 years right next door to a vineyard where they use Roundup, and I have a suspicion that that may be connected with my Parkinson's disease.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about, remind me to talk about vineyards, because I think you're right. I don't think it's Roundup, but turns out, I'll talk about it right now. Turns out that vineyards are among the biggest consumers of pesticides, and there's this great study in France which looks at the amount of pesticides used on vineyards, and there's a beautiful correlation, 0.96 for the math people in the room, between the amount of pesticides used on the vineyards and the rates of Parkinson's disease in those communities. So we're going to talk a little bit about pesticides, and so that would be a good reason why you might have Parkinson's disease. And if you still live next to the vineyard, we're going to tell you a little bit about checking your well water if you have well water, or being really, really careful about the air that you breathe. Anyone else have a suggestion or idea? I'm all ears. I like to learn.
This is Sandy.
Hi, Sandy.
Hi. I think after having a concussion, I didn't stop doing my activities, and I still played soccer, and I still mountain biked, and I still played tennis. So my head was constantly jostled, and I didn't let my brain heal.
So we discussed that in chapter 6. And so one concussion raises your risk a little bit. Significant concussions associated with amnesia or loss of consciousness can raise it. And then things like concussions can have interactions with pesticides like paraquat or other environmental causes of Parkinson's disease and increase your likelihood of developing the disease even more. Anyone else?
I think because of the way I sleep, because of my habit of sleeping.
I'm sorry, say it again, Alice.
Because of my habit of sleeping. And I stay up very late. was working too hard.
She was
Just-
working too hard and she has a bad habit of sleeping, like
Oh.
her habits of sleeping.
Yeah, I think the sleeping problems are part of Parkinson's disease and not the cause. I think it's part of the disease itself. I'll actually show you some little bit of evidence on that. So I think those are consequences of Parkinson's and not the causes of them.
Oh, consequence. Okay.
Good. Well, I'm going to show you some more, and then you put it in the chat or in the question and answer. You're going to tell me some, help teach me, because I like to learn about why people have Parkinson's disease.
Ray,
So-
before you get started, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, my
No
apologies.
worries.
It sounds like your mic is a little too high. I'm not sure,
Too hot.
a little too hot, you know,
Volume.
maybe the volume or too close. We're just getting a little reverberation back there.
Is that better?
That sounds better.
Not really.
I mean, it's,
I don't know. Is that better? It's better.
If you turn your volume down on your computer, maybe,
Okay,
limit it.
1 second.
let's see if that changes.
Let's see if I can do something.
that already sounded better to me, just him not.
Oh, hold on. Microphone. Okay, yeah, hold on. Is that better?
Yes.
Way better. Thank you. Okay, here.
Beautiful. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about the age of degenerative and man-made diseases and argue to you that Parkinson's disease is to a large extent man-made. We created this disease. Humans create diseases like, car accidents, smoking, which lung cancer, which we'll talk about in a second. But to a large extent, I think Parkinson's disease is caused by environmental factors that are the result of humans. And to the extent that Parkinson's disease is human created, we humans can end it. And it's going to be incumbent on the people on this call who have the most at stake to help get this message out so we can prevent the world's fastest growing brain disease. Now, I'm going to talk to you about how Parkinson's disease used to be a really, really rare disease 200 years ago, and now it's the world's fastest growing brain disease. And then leave you with some thoughts on suggestions on how we can help end Parkinson's disease, and maybe have a little request for you at the end. You can see my slides okay? Perfect. All right. So this really smart French-American scientist, René Dubos, in 1959, he said that every civilization has its own kind of pestilence and can control it only by reforming itself. Put into modern day English, every society creates its own diseases. And among those diseases, it's up there. So humans create their own diseases. And this really smart epidemiologist, Abdul Omran, in 1971, wrote a very influential paper in which he looked at what were the drivers of population growth among humans. And so humans, like modern Homo sapiens, have been around for 100,000 years. And early humans died simply because they didn't have enough food. Pestilence and famine prevented population growth. The agrarian revolution happened about 10,000 years ago, and that allowed for concentration of food, concentration of populations, and for population growth. And the chief source of death in those days were receding pandemics. Think smallpox, think the bubonic plague in the 14th century, and the influenza pandemic in the 1918. And Abdul Omran said that in 1971, we start living in this age of degenerative and man-made diseases. And other people have extended his research and suggested that in the future, we'll die of emerging infections born out of hubris, of which COVID-19 may be, but that's for another day. But lung cancer is the poster child for a man-made disease. So I want you to take a look at this graph, and this shows you lung cancer deaths in the United States from about 1925 until the present time. And it shows you cigarette smoking. And so if you look 100 years ago, there was essentially almost no lung cancer in the United States. So 100 years ago, there was almost no lung cancer in the United States. Indeed, lung cancer was so rare, it was considered a once-in-a-lifetime oddity by doctors, and they'd gather around all the doctors and all the medical students to show them a case of lung cancer because they thought they'd never see another case. But in the late 1800s in England and the early 1900s in the United States, cigarette companies introduced cigarettes, especially in World War I. And you can see about 25 years after cigarettes were introduced into the United States, you see a corresponding rise in the number of lung cancer deaths. And then you can see one of the great public health achievements of the last 50 years has been a decline in smoking, and you can see that in the 1970s. And then about 25 years after cigarette smoking starts to decline, you can see a nice corresponding decline in lung cancer deaths about 25 years later. So no lung cancer in 1900. Lung cancer happens after people start smoking. Doesn't happen right away, but there's a 25-year lag. I think this is a great model for thinking about what's happening with Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease, as some of you may know, was described by Dr. James Parkinson in 1817. And Dr. Parkinson at that time was about 61 years old. He'd been practicing medicine for 30 years. His father was a physician. He knew a lot about medicine. And what he described was something that he had said had not been classified in the medical literature. So the 61-year-old physician who'd been around the block a few times says, I'm writing a case series of 6 individuals who have this new disease that's not been classified in the medical literature. And what he describes are 3 people that he actually cared for and 3 people he just observed walking on the streets of London. And these 6 individuals had a stooped posture, a pill-rolling tremor, and a tendency to shuffle their gait and tend to go really fast uncontrolled. Just like some of you can recognize people walking on the streets with Parkinson's disease today, Dr. Parkinson, when he described it, was saying, this is something new. About 50 years later, a French neurologist, the father of modern neurology, just named the disease La Maladie de Parkinson, or Parkinson's disease. In early 1900s, a German scientist identified a misfolded protein under the microscope in individuals with Parkinson's. 1950s, Arvid Carlson identified that people with Parkinson's had less dopamine in their brains. A chemical neurotransmitter was less common in people with Parkinson's disease, which led to the development 10, 15 years later of levodopa, still the most effective medication for Parkinson's disease, developed in the 1960s. In 1983, about 40 years ago, not far from where many of you are sitting, a regular neurologist, Dr. William Langston, who's still living, still in the faculty now at Stanford University, identified individuals who had been using a street form of heroin who acutely, almost overnight, developed what looked like Parkinson's disease. The amazing thing was that this was happening not to older adults, not to people in their 50s and 60s, but to people in their 20s and 30s. And it was coming on all of a sudden. They would be entirely normal one day, smoke the heroin, and then soon thereafter develop Parkinson's disease. It turns out that the people who were making these street forms of heroin were decent chemists, but not great chemists, because they contaminated that heroin with a chemical called MPTP. And that MPTP kills off the dopamine-producing nerve cells that are lost in Parkinson's disease and cause these individuals to have lifelong Parkinson's disease. The last of this cohort died recently. That chemical MPTP bears a striking chemical resemblance to a pesticide called paraquat that we think is responsible for some people having Parkinson's disease. In the 1990s, the first genetic cause of Parkinson's disease was identified by a group of scientists from Italy, Sweden, the United States. It turns out about 15% of people have an identifiable genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease, but the vast majority of individuals, 85%, do not have an identifiable genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease. In 2003, a really smart German pathologist, Dr. Heiko Brock, who is still living, postulated that Parkinson's disease, previously known as a brain disease, does not begin in the brain, but that Parkinson's disease may begin in the gut or in the nose. And that the first symptoms of Parkinson's disease aren't actually the tremor or loss of smell, but the tremor or difficulty moving, but loss of smell, constipation, and as Alice was suggesting, difficulties with sleep. And this gives us some clues as to where Parkinson's disease might be originating. And in 2017, exactly 200 years after Dr. Parkinson first wrote his essay on the disease that would bear his name, Parkinson's disease went from likely a very rare condition to the world's fastest growing brain disease in the world, all in the span of just 2 centuries. So this is what Dr. Parkinson's essay was. He called it the essay on the shaking palsy. He didn't call it Parkinson's disease. But what's going on in London in 1817? Well, in London 1817 is the height of the Industrial Revolution, and London's the capital. And any of you have been watching the TV series The Crown know that the London fog has little to do with weather and everything to do with air pollution. And since that time, numerous products and byproducts of the Industrial Revolution, including air pollution, synthetic or certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, including one called trichloroethylene, and heavy metals, have all been linked to Parkinson's disease. And indeed, the very first person that Dr. Parkinson described in his case series was a man who made his life as a gardener, and there are naturally occurring pesticides that plants produce that have also been linked to Parkinson's disease. And so when Dr. Parkinson described it, he identified 6 people with Parkinson's disease, but in 2015, there were at least 6 million people with Parkinson's disease, twice as many as there were 25 years later. And conservative projections suggest the number of individuals will double again in the coming 25 years. And just like most of you, have more friends and family members who have Parkinson's disease, or you're noticing more Parkinson's disease, that's because there's a lot more Parkinson's disease around. Just to give you a flavor, 200 people today were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and 100 Americans today died from Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is not just a US problem. In fact, the rates are even higher to our neighbors to the north in Canada. And if you look a little bit at this map, you can see there seems to be a trend that the areas of the world that are most industrialized have the highest rates of disease. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest rates of the disease. And you can't see it here, but areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China and India, have the fastest increasing rates of Parkinson's disease. So the earlier question was, sleep disorders are common in Parkinson's disease, and that those are called REM behavioral disorders. People have this tendency to act out their dreams at night. They might even strike their bed partner, for example, and there are other sleep disorders that happen that are one of the earlier features of Parkinson's disease that predate the tremor and the slowness of movement. But the first signs of Parkinson's disease, first symptoms of Parkinson's disease, are loss of smell and constipation. And I'm going to postulate to you that many of the environmental factors tied to Parkinson's disease, air pollution, certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, heavy metals, either enter in through the nose, they're either inhaled, or they're consumed in the food we drink or the water we food we eat or the water we drink. And these early symptoms can develop years, if not decades, before the classic motor features of Parkinson's disease. And if you look, there's some compelling evidence. Just like there was, Parkinson's disease was really rare before 1817, air pollution wasn't much of a problem before the Industrial Revolution. You can see in this graph, looking at sulfur dioxide emissions, there's minimal air pollution except in Europe in the 1850s, where Parkinson's disease was first described, at least a seminal description. After air pollution clogged the air of Europe, it clogged the air of North America. Then Asia, think Beijing today, where the rates of Parkinson's disease have doubled over the last 25 years. And so far, at least in Africa, although not immune to the problem. And then synthetic pesticides were really introduced in World War II and then became wide use after World War II. For those of you who've read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring in 1962, she cautioned against the indiscriminate use of pesticides, but despite her prescient words of caution, we continue to consume more and more pesticides. And one of these pesticides is called paraquat. Paraquat was developed in the 1950s. It was considered the most toxic herbicide ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup can't. And over 30 countries, including China, have banned this chemical, but the United States has not. And in fact, in October of last year, the United States, the EPA reauthorized its use. Paraquat's use has tripled in the last 25 years, doubled in the last decade, and increased 20% in the year, most recent year for which data are available. Widely used in the Central Valley of California, and essentially covers almost the entire United States. There are lawsuits right now trying to hold the makers of this pesticide accountable for its use. And there are other pesticides, another one called chlorpyrifos, which is widely used on golf courses and utility poles that are still used and linked to Parkinson's disease. And I mentioned many of the pesticides used on vineyards have also been linked to Parkinson's disease. The other chemical I want to highlight is one called trichloroethylene. And I used to have a model of the chemical, and I'll have to find my model. So trichloroethylene is a really, really simple chemical. When you look at its structure, it's got a grand total of 6 atoms, 2 carbons, 3 chlorines, hence its name, and 1 hydrogen. And it's widely used as a degreasing agent. And then for many of you, it's widely used in Silicon Valley to clean off silicon wafers. It dissolves away organic debris. And so after circuits are put onto silicon wafer chips, they were evidently washed with TCE and contaminated much of Silicon Valley, which I'll show you in a second. And there have been TCE in the 1970s, according to the New York Times, was ubiquitous. It was found in whiteout. Any of you who drank Senka decaffeinated coffee were exposed to TCE. It's used in carpet cleaners, widely used in dry cleaning, still used in spot dry cleaning, used in embalming fluid, used in paints and painting, in textile manufacturing. 8% of workers in England, for example, have worked with TCE. If you've worked with TCE, I would love to hear from you when we get to the questions and answers. And work done by Dr. Carly Tanner and Sam Goldman, both in San Francisco, both at University of California, San Francisco, currently from 10 years ago, demonstrated that TCE among twins who are exposed to TCE versus those unexposed increased the risk of Parkinson's disease, not by 5%, not by 15%, not by 50%, but by a whopping 500%. Individuals exposed to TCE who worked with it are 500% more likely to develop Parkinson's disease than twins who did not work with TCE. And TCE is found everywhere. Half of Superfund sites, the most contaminated sites in the United States that have been designated for federal cleanup, are contaminated with TCE. There are about, I think, 800 of them throughout the United States, and there are thousands of other of these sites contaminated with TCE throughout the country, including one I found 15 minutes from my house in suburban Rochester that I learned about from writing the book. And the capital of these, the capital of this is Silicon Valley. So there are 15 contaminated TCE sites, Superfund sites, contaminated with TCE on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway near all of you. Say that again. There are 15 Superfund sites contaminated with TCE, some from the Department of Defense, many from private companies, and many in the tech industry on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway. There are 21 Superfund sites contaminated with TCE just in Silicon Valley alone. And so these are found at Moffett Field Air Force Base. These are found at Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, Raytheon, Applied Materials. All the companies that are the hallmarks of Silicon Valley have been, many of them were large users of TCE. So what's the problem with TCE? Well, a few problems. One, for those people who work with it, if you worked in electronics or with semiconductors, you were likely exposed to TCE. But you can also breathe in TCE from the air where it's emitted, or potentially worse is TCE is often disposed of by pouring it into the ground, and there it contaminates the soil and underlying groundwater. So up to 30% of groundwater in the United States is contaminated with TCE, including water from that contaminated site 15 minutes from my house. And then TCE gets into the water and forms these underground plumes that can migrate away from the contaminated site and evaporate into people's homes, schools, and workplaces undetected. So just like some of you know about radon evaporating from the soil, and if you bought a house with a basement, you probably had a radon test done. TCE can also evaporate into people's homes and be undetected. And this isn't a theoretical risk. This is Jane Horton, who lives across the street from one of the headquarters of Google, which was built on the top of a Superfund site contaminated by Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel. And Jane Horton was concerned about this, read about it, and had her indoor air tested. And her indoor air was found to be markedly elevated, contamination was markedly elevated, far above safety levels. So she had a relatively simple TCE remediation system put in next to her utility box that basically sucks the air from underneath her house and vents it above her house. So while TCE contamination is a problem, it's readily addressable with a simple TCE remediation system. For new construction, you can just put a vapor barrier, essentially a large garbage bag, on the ground and prevent TCE from entering people's workplaces or homes. It turns out that on her street, in her street Walker Drive, that 6 people who resided on that developed Parkinson's disease, and 4 people developed brain cancer because TCE is a known carcinogen, according to the EPA, the World Health Organization, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, all of this is known. So this is a letter written by Dr. Kerry McCord from my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. And he was working for Chrysler Corporation. He was a medical officer at Chrysler Corporation. And he wrote this article called The Toxicity of Trichloroethylene to the Journal of the American Medical Association. And he said promotional activities seeking the extension of industrial uses of trichloroethylene frequently fail to disclose the toxic nature of this chemical and the practical dangers that may attend its use. And in a series of experiments, he had rabbits inhale TCE and the rabbits died. And he put TCE on the skin of rabbits and they died. And then he concludes that any manufacturer contemplating the use of trichloroethylene may find in it many desirable qualities. It's a great solvent. 2, in the absence of closed systems of operation, he may find in this solvent the source of disaster for exposed workmen. He wrote this article in 1932. He wrote this article in 1932. So no one here probably was even alive in 1932. So we've known for over 80 years, 90 years about the toxicity of trichloroethylene, yet we still permit its use. And we still permit thousands, if not millions of Americans, probably millions of Americans, probably tens of millions of Americans, to experience its adverse consequences, including cancer, Parkinson's disease, and many other diseases. So that's all the bad news. So what can we do to help end Parkinson's disease? So in the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, we outline a PACT, a PACT, to help end Parkinson's disease. And the first step to any crisis, whether it's a fire or COVID or Parkinson's disease, is to contain it and to stop fueling it. And we can do that by preventing people from ever developing Parkinson's disease to begin with. The first step to doing that is to ban some of these chemicals, paraquat and trichloroethylene. Other countries have banned them. There are safer alternatives to be had. No one would drive a car or fly an airplane from the 1920s or 1950s because there are safer alternatives. If engineers can develop safer alternatives from airplanes and cars from the 1920s and 50s, chemists certainly can develop safer alternatives to these chemicals. Second thing we can all do as individuals is exercise. So vigorous exercise is great for people with the disease and can decrease your risk of developing Parkinson's by about 50%. Eating a Mediterranean diet, high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products. Some animals concentrate the effects of pesticides like dairy, can decrease your risk of Parkinson's disease. Caffeine can be beneficial for people with Parkinson's and decrease your risk of ever developing it. And as Sarah suggested, protecting your head and decreasing your risk of concussions can be beneficial. So when you go for your bike ride, wear a helmet. Second thing we need to do is advocate. At the same time, the number of Americans with Parkinson's has increased 35% over the last 10 years. NIH funding, adjusted for inflation, has actually decreased. So the number of Americans with Parkinson's has increased 35%. Same time, NIH funding, adjusted for inflation, has actually decreased for Parkinson's. That won't get the job done. My colleague Michael Oken says we need an Operation Warp Speed for Parkinson's. We need to increase research funding for Parkinson's tenfold to make meaningful progress against this disease that's affecting 1.2 million Americans. And people like you need to make your voices heard. And that's going to be the central argument here, is when people make their voices heard, change happens. In the 1930s, some of you remember that polio was ravaging communities, closed down churches and houses of worship and community centers and swimming pools. And then a group of people started something called the March of Dimes and raised millions of dollars, which led to Jonas Salk and then Albert Sabin developing highly effective vaccines for Parkinson's disease. And none of us spent any time worrying about getting polio because it's been eradicated from the United States and from the vast majority of the world. Similar in the 1980s, in your community in San Francisco and New York, a group of activists made their voices heard when an unknown disease was ravaging communities in San Francisco and New York. And this infectious disease had no federal response or almost minimal federal response. And a group of activists formed organizations like ACT UP, which had a slogan of silence equals death. Because for people with HIV, silence did equal death, because those individuals absent with their silence, they were dying. And when they stopped being silent, when they made their voices heard, when they took over the FDA, when they took over pharmaceutical companies, when they took over the New York Stock Exchange, when they took over the streets of New York, people started to pay attention, federal funding increased, and the therapeutic development accelerated. 15 years after they made their voices heard, highly effective treatments were developed for HIV, and HIV today is associated with a near normal life expectancy. The third element of the PACT C is for care. We should bring care to patients, not patients to care. It's kind of odd that generally healthy clinicians like me ask generally sick patients or disabled patients like you to come see us on our terms. We should see you on your terms. And one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic has been telemedicine. How many people received care via telemedicine in the last year or 2 years? Yes, so you guys all probably, and how many people liked receiving care via telemedicine? How many people didn't like it? Wow, so exactly, one person didn't like it. So telemedicine expansion, Medicare's expansion of telemedicine was temporary. It's tied to the public health emergency. It can go away. When the public health emergency goes away, telemedicine expanded reimbursement will go away unless you make your voices heard and tell your congresswomen and men and representatives and senators to make sure that telemedicine coverage is maintained after the pandemic. It's your taxpayer dollars. You should determine how your taxpayer dollars are used to provide health care to you. Make sure telemedicine stays permanent. Finally, we need to get better effective treatments for people with Parkinson's disease. We had more therapeutic breakthroughs, levodopa, which I mentioned, and deep brain stimulation last century than we've had this century. We need to get better measures of the disease, objective measures of the disease. Stop asking people to tap their thumb and index finger and having people like me rate that on a categorical scale from goes from 0 to 4. Objective measures of the disease so we can get better measures, better treatments faster. Better measures, better treatments faster. So this was the motto of the ACT UP organization formed in New York City, and they said silence equals death. And for Parkinson's disease, silence doesn't equal death, but silence equals suffering. And to me, it equals needless and preventable suffering. So now when I see people with Parkinson's disease on the streets or when I'm biking or when I see them in the airport, I get upset. I quite frankly get pissed off because I think Parkinson's disease is to a large extent preventable. And bad things happen to people, but if there are bad things happening to people that we can prevent, we should prevent it from happening in the first place. And until we figure out why you have Parkinson's disease, we're not going to prevent the disease. And more Americans, including your spouses, your siblings, your nephews, your children, will be at higher and higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Until we figure out what's causing Parkinson's disease, it's going to spread. And we're giving you some really good ideas about what's likely driving it. And we need to act and prevent people from ever getting the disease in the first place. So if I fired you up, these are the co-authors of the book, Todd Shear, who used to be the chief executive officer of Michael J. Fox Foundation, Michael Oken, who's a pioneer in DBS, and Bas Bloom, who's developed the best integrated care model for Parkinson's disease in Europe and the United States. You need to make your voices heard. So you should join the PD Avengers, pdavengers.com, which is a global grassroots organization formed by people with the disease, led by Larry Gifford, an American who's living in Canada, who's a host of a podcast called When Life Gives You Parkinson's. And then you can help us by reading the book. So if you haven't purchased the book, I'll show you how you can do so. Oops, sorry. Well, you can just go to Amazon. Go to Ending Parkinson's Disease. Somewhere in here is our book. And you can get it for paperback. It's $16.99. If you cannot afford the book, we will send you one for free. You just send us an email at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org. It's in the chat. Just say, Ray, could you please send me a copy of your book and give me your mailing address, and we will send you a copy of the book for free. If you haven't gotten the book and you can afford it, please read it. If you read it and you like the book, please review it. So there's 395 ratings. Maybe end of today, we can get to 400. All you have to do to review a book on Amazon is click this button that says write a customer review. And then if you're logged in, hopefully, I don't think I'm logged in. I'm not logged in. And then it'll immediately come up with a thing to put your review in. It takes less than 2 minutes. So if you've read the book and you like it, write a review for the book. I think that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'll take any questions you guys have.
Anybody have a question you guys want to unmute? Thank you, Ray. He said we could call him Ray, by the way, Lise. Yeah. Thank you so much. We love your style. We love the passion behind it. You guys read the book. It's a lot of great information, and, you know, advocate, just like you said, we want to make sure that we're ending Parkinson's. And anyway, so any Q&As that you guys have, or I'm sorry, any questions that you guys have for Ray right now, go ahead and unmute or raise your hand and we'll help you unmute.
Cheryl,
go ahead, Cheryl. Cheryl, go ahead.
I'm wondering about with COVID and all of the antibacterial hand wipes and chemicals. Is that TCE potentially in?
No. So fortunately, TCE has been limited to only 2 permitted uses by the EPA. Still uses for vapor degreasing. So if anyone works in degreasing, I'd love to hear from you. They basically boil TCE. It rarely boils. It boils at about 70 degrees Celsius, and it's used to clean off metal parts. And then spot dry cleaning is still permitted to be used. So unlikely. I think we're in the United States. We're fine.
Okay, thanks.
Dorsey, I've got a fine for you. I grew up in Northern California. Can you hear me?
Yes. Is that Dr. Smiley?
Yes. I grew up in Northern California, and they used to go ahead and thing called mosquito abatement district. They used to put pesticides down the main roads. We were told to play. We ran along behind and breathing this stuff in.
Were you breathing pesticides on the roads, you said?
The stuff was sitting out there had a Jeep and a big blower out there, a big billow of white clouds. We were told it was safe and just have fun. So,
yeah, so DDT, yeah.
We're fighting English, Dr. Dorsey.
Yeah, so this indiscriminate use of pesticides. So I'm going to read you something from Rachel Carson. If you guys haven't read Silent Spring and you like to read, Silent Spring is one of the best nonfiction books ever written. And she wrote in her book in 1962, speaking about pesticides, just a fictional account. The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. And among those new types of sickness is Parkinson's disease. She didn't know that, of course, in 1962, but.
Commercial law firms are now making money by advertising for people who had that.
Yeah, so there were some lawsuits now being brought against the.
They are morals going to be lawyers.
And I'm not consulting for any of these law firms, but if you look at the evidence linking Roundup to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you compare that to the pesticides like paraquat and Parkinson's, there's no comparison. The strength of the connection between pesticides and Parkinson's is much greater than that between Roundup and cancer.
Thank you for your presentation. I just ordered your book.
Thank you.
Oh, can I say something?
Sure.
I'm Sandy. Yeah.
Sandy.
So I have been reading your book.
Thank you.
And all right, so we have Parkinson's. So what can we do to make ourselves better? I mean, I've talked to doctors that have done like stem cell injections and, what other things can we look at?
So if you have Parkinson's disease, about half to 2/3 of your nerve cells that produce dopamine have died off. So I would be protecting the other half and the other third that remain. So this is what I do. I started buying organic. I wash all my fruits and vegetables with a vegetable wash. You can just get it at the grocery store. I put it in a big bowl and I wash all my fruits and vegetables and I rinse them in the night before I eat them. I put a carbon filter on my water that comes into our house, just, like a pure or whatever you want to get at the grocery store, so that that carbon filter removes TCE and other chemicals. If I had Parkinson's, I'd be exercising 2 hours a day. If you're ever not doing rock steady boxing or bicycling, or if looking at you, Sandy, you look like you could do vigorous exercise. I would be doing vigorous exercise, and I would do 2 hours a day if I had Parkinson's disease. I'd wear a helmet and I'd protect my helmet if I like to bicycle or ski or do anything along those lines. Those are all the things I would do. Their medications can be helpful. Levodopa is highly effective for people with Parkinson's. There are a class of drugs called MAOB inhibitors, selegiline or rasagiline or Azilect. These in animal models have been shown to slow the rate of Parkinson's disease, and they offer modest benefit in people with it. So I would probably consider taking those medications. But I would protect my nerve cells from these toxins by getting away, minimizing my exposure to those. I'd probably start eating a Mediterranean diet. I would put a water filter, carbon filter on my water. I'd protect my head. I would do vigorous exercise because that's been shown to keep nerve cells from dying off. It releases growth factors. I'd talk to my doctor about an MAOB inhibitor like rasagiline or selegiline and take modest amounts of levodopa.
Can we get your email address? I've got things I want to send you.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Can we get your email address and things I want to send you?
Sure. info@endingpd.org. I put that in the chat. If you just click on chat, you can see the email, and I review all those emails that come in.
Great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there a certain age that you're exposed to pesticides, that it starts affecting you?
So we don't know the answer to that question. If you look at, we have spent, since 1960, there are 7 times more publications on genetic factors influencing Parkinson's than environmental factors. And there have been a woeful underinvestment in answering these questions. We don't know, as a simple answer. I suspect that it probably matters when. I think children and even babies have developing brains and may be more susceptible to the effects of pesticides. So you may think that you didn't get exposed to pesticides, but 40 million Americans, 1 out of 8 Americans drink their water from wells. So if you grew up in a rural area, in fact, if you grew up in Silicon Valley and 70 years ago, you might have been drinking well water. And those wells are not regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act and have a tendency to have pesticides washed off from nearby farms and contaminate that water. And so people can drink it. Or, in the 1950s, they were spraying this and, little kids were running behind the pesticide truck, breathing it in, or they were spraying it on top of you. And probably in Silicon Valley, they were probably doing that in the 1950s. So my suspicion, well, I think at any age it could be, but I would be most concerned about kids. And it turns out that some of these pesticides are dissolved in milk. And if you want a scary story, is that you can find these pesticides in the milk from lactating women, from nursing women that are then feeding pesticide contaminated breast milk to their infants. And that still goes on today.
I have one more question. Which is the pesticide that they're still using on golf courses?
The one I know, I don't want the Golf Course Association coming after me, is the chlorpyrifos. I'll put it in the, if I type it in the chat, will you be able to see it, Ms. Arnold?
Yes, can you spell that for me?
Yes, CHLORPYRIFOS. And again, all of this is in the book.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Ms. Bushnell is, I think, very eager to ask a question.
Yes, I have 2 questions. Speaking of golf courses, how dangerous is it to live next door to someone who gets their lawn sprayed by a lawn service every couple of months? For me,
again, unknown. I'll just tell you what, we have more dandelions in our yard than any of our neighbors. I wouldn't, if I had Parkinson's, I would have no part in being around my neighbor spraying pesticides.
Well,
Not all pesticides are linked to Parkinson's, but I would not be hanging out if I had Parkinson's disease when my neighbors were spraying pesticides.
I just worry about the runoff after it rains. I know that we get some of their runoff in our yard, and I don't know what to do, if I should just approach them and tell them my concerns, or because I'm very concerned about them.
I would, listen, we got to educate a lot of people. Listen, I got educated for the last 2 years. I had the gift of a sabbatical, and I didn't know half the stuff. I didn't know 90% of the stuff I just told you until I did the research. And I would be concerned if I'd wear a mask. I'd be most concerned about inhaling it if it were my neighbor, assuming I'm getting city water, because city water is tested. That I would be most concerned about, like when they're applying it. That's what I would be concerned about.
And I had one more question too, if I could ask you.
Yes.
Do you mention Lyme disease? Because Lyme disease is called the great impersonator, the great imposter. And I had Lyme disease. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, but I think that I have Lyme disease because as my Lyme disease is getting treated, my Parkinson's is getting a little better. So
there have been some research looking at this. I don't think Lyme disease, to my knowledge, has much of anything to do with Parkinson's. Now, having Parkinson's doesn't protect you from getting Lyme disease, doesn't protect you from getting, cancer or many other conditions. But I don't think Lyme disease is not a significant cause of Parkinson's. At least
I have a question. I live in Sacramento, California, here, Northern California.
Yes.
And they come through every year and they spray overhead, but from an airplane because of the mosquitoes and West Nile disease. Is that something that we need to be worrying about?
So again, certain pests, there's like a long list. The list of pesticides is long. It's exhausting. It's like, 50, 100 different pesticides. I don't know what they're spraying from those things. And I don't know if those pesticides are linked to Parkinson's disease. But if I had Parkinson's, I would not be hanging out outside when they're spraying.
Yeah.
And if I were getting water from my well, I would test my well for pesticides and for TCE, but especially if I lived in a rural area, for pesticides.
Thank you.
Is there a list of products that have TCE in them? I saw your picture, like with WD-40 and
yeah.
stuff. Is there a list of
I think in the United States, I think very few products currently have TCE in them, but I'll tell you stories. I know a cyclist who used TCE because it's a degreasing agent to clean his bicycle chain, when he was a kid. And then, 30 years later, he developed Parkinson's disease. And that story goes on and on and on. And while the problem in the US, the big issue are those people who are still working with it and those contaminated sites. But TCE use is increasing 2 to 4% throughout the rest of the world.
Wow.
I have a question. I have my hand up. Is there a way we're going through this?
Yes, Mr. Nevin, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, doctor. The question I have basically is you went through some of the potential causes of Parkinson's, which, concussion, exposure, environmental exposure, genetic factor perhaps. And you also went through a list of all the things that you would be doing if you had it now: diet, filtering water, 2 hours of exercise a day at a minimum, which I thought was a great list. Does it matter what the cause of our Parkinson's was if we already have it? Because it seems to me part of what you're saying is continuing exposure may continue to attack the dopamine we do have left.
So we don't know. It may not be. It may not be. It may not be. There are drugs that are being developed that target some of the underlying genetic causes. So there's a company called Denali Therapeutics. Full disclosure, I've done consulting for them in the Bay Area. Is developing a drug that inhibits one of those genetic causes of Parkinson's called LRRK2. It's a gene called LRRK2. Which contributes to Parkinson's, and they're developing a drug that targets it. So for those individuals who carry that mutation, this drug might be the perfect gene-directed therapy. Just like for certain types of cancer, for breast cancer, there's certain types of cancer that respond to hormone treatment and some that don't. In addition, TCE, that LRRK2 mutation increases the activity of a LRRK2 protein. It turns out that TCE, just like that genetic mutation, also increases the activity of that LRRK2 protein. So it's possible in the future, not today, possible in the future that certain treatments will work better for certain individuals depending on what their cause of Parkinson's disease is. Right now, we just don't have very good information on what's causing it or cause-directed treatments. But I would avoid getting an ongoing exposure to these environmental factors.
So the goal of ending Parkinson's really is ending it as an ongoing disease for the next group of people that get it, as opposed to us that already have it.
Let me just give you an example. If there's a house burning, what's the first thing you do?
Run out of the
Out of
house.
the house.
Get them out of the house.
Yeah.
Right? Then you go tend to the people who are stuck in the house. But the first thing you do is you get the people out of the house. And just like COVID, I'll give you another example. What's the best way to handle COVID? Not get it in the first place. So we got this backwards. We're fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease. We're chasing our tails. There are very few cures out there. I mean, think about breast cancer. Think about how much money, how much effort, how much pink is out there, and no one talks about preventing breast cancer. It's all about diagnosis and treatment. We need to stop, take a step back and say, hey, we got the world's fastest growing brain disease. How about we prevent people from getting this disease and also take care of the 1.2 million Americans who have the disease? Because otherwise, if all we do is keep looking for a cure, we're just going to keep getting more and more people with Parkinson's disease. 200 more tomorrow.
Thank you.
Ms. Kelzer?
Yes, this is Charlene. I'm wondering what you know or have studied about stress and both to affect the getting of Parkinson's and maybe the ongoing care for it. Because it seems like a lot of people get diagnosed with Parkinson's shortly after there's been some major stress in their life.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why, but I think, as I told you, Parkinson's disease has been around. By the time people were diagnosed, they've likely had the pathology of Parkinson's disease has been unfolding for 20, 30 years, if not more. And it turned likely controlled by compensatory mechanisms, not exactly sure what those are. And people get sick, they get stressed, they have some kind of big psychosocial stressor, they end up in the hospital, and all of a sudden the symptoms become unmasked, often unmasked in the setting of a medical setting where they're around other doctors who might see it. So I think stress is a big component, because Parkinson's disease, we know, is indolent, is hiding in people long before they develop the disease, long before they show the features of the disease, the tremor. Yes. In addition, for people with Parkinson's disease, we know that stress makes their symptoms worse. So exercise, Tai Chi, meditation, yoga, all likely to be beneficial or are beneficial for people with Parkinson's.
Thank you.
So I see it's Ms. Ebby.
Ebby.
If you can raise your hand using there's a little function that has raise your hand, and I can just see it. That'd be great.
All right. This is just to give you some data for possible causes. I worked in the fashion industry for 35 years, and was handling fabrics every day, every work day of my life for that amount of time. So you think that TCE was used in the finishing of fabrics?
So, I don't know. I was going to ask you, because, this is how I learned, because, in medical school, we didn't get a lecture on the fabrics industry. So
right.
I didn't learn, but this is what I'm finding.
I know that formaldehyde is one of the things that is used in the finishing of fabric. That's the only thing I know.
I know I have another patient of mine who worked in the textile industry, and likely was working with trichloroethylene. So that's where I just did a quick search, and there's a whole list of TCE and textiles and fabrics out there.
All right, thank you.
So Ms. Hausman?
Yeah, hi. So you talked about Parkinson's beginning in the gut or nose. And so like if you've had gut problems throughout your whole life, but not the constipation, the other end, could that be part of it, or?
So I'll tell you what we know. There's a lot we don't know. So constipation begins years, if not decades, in people with Parkinson's disease. About 80% of people with Parkinson's disease have constipation, and that we think in many individuals that constipation precedes the classic tremor and slowness of movement. I don't know much around diarrhea and other things. You know, there's a wide range of other gastrointestinal problems that are likely unrelated to Parkinson's disease, but I can't tell you for certain. In some individuals, we've seen evidence of that misfolded protein is called a Lewy body, being found in the gut of people with Parkinson's disease before they develop the classic motor features of it. In the nose, where the evidence is much stronger, you find the pathology of Parkinson's disease in the olfactory centers, the smell centers of the brain, far before you find it in the dopamine producing nerve cells centers of the brain.
A long time.
Also, did you say that like painting and electronics, groundwater have the TCE in it? Like
yeah, so lots of paints used to in the United States because it's a great solvent. Things can dissolve in it really well. And electronics widely used in the thing. And if you read chapter 5 of the book, we talk about a guy who worked in the aerospace industry in Southern California who was using circuit boards and using it using TCE, just pouring it to clean off circuit boards. So widely used for that.
But when you refer to painting, are you talking like as an artist painting?
Yeah, so this is where you got to help me out. So I know one of my wife's uncles actually is a prominent painter, and I think he developed Parkinson's disease. And I think when I've done a little bit of research, I found that TCE is widely used in painters. Now, I don't imagine that it's used today in the United States, but if I would have you look and see what kind of paints you were using and what kind of chemicals you were using if you were painting in the past.
Okay. There was one more. Okay, I don't.
We'll come back to. I see two people who've asked me questions already. There are other people who haven't asked me a question. I see any other hands up. We'll go Mr. Brenner, and then I see Ms. Bauman and Dr. Smiley.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I had to take a very short telephone call, so I missed some of what you said, but relative to food, let me start off with, I'm sort of a wine aficionado, but I've cut my wine down to about 4 ounces a day, no more than 4 ounces mixed in sparkling water. So that's fairly minuscule, but what's your take on red wine?
Enjoy.
And you said coffee, enjoy.
So coffee you can enjoy too, caffeinated coffee. It turns out caffeine, likely caffeine, not the coffee, can decrease your risk of developing Parkinson's disease, can be modest benefit for people with the disease, and helps a lot with daytime sleepiness for people with the disease.
Okay, thank you. Any other, but very quickly, any foods, you mentioned the Mediterranean diet, and you've mentioned a couple of things that we can enjoy, but there's some things that are an absolute no-no.
You know what, this is me, and again, we don't know because we haven't done the studies. I get concerned about foods that would have lots of pesticides in them. So I mentioned organics and washing my fruits and vegetables. Some pesticides dissolve in fat, and so there have been studies linking milk, higher rates of consumption of milk to Parkinson's disease. I don't think it's milk per se. It could be milk per se, but I think it's the pesticides in the milk. In the book, we describe a study in Hawaii where the cows were eating pesticide-laden pineapple tops. And when you looked at their milk, it was contaminated with this pesticide called heptachlor. And then when they looked at the people who drank a lot of milk in Hawaii, when some of them have Parkinson's disease, and when you look at their brains, they had heptachlor, the pesticide, in their brain.
Oh, brother.
Exactly. And we still do this stuff. I will go Mr. Alexander, and then we'll go to Ms. Bowman.
Yes, I have a question about the nasal versus oral route. Is there any indication of what the other symptoms are associated with one route versus the other, for instance, tremor dominance or medication resistant?
We don't know. So it turns out that guy Brock, that German pathologist in 2003, saying that Parkinson's disease doesn't begin in the brain, it begins in the nose and the gut. It likely can go from the gut up to other centers that control, among other things, sleep. So the earlier, one of the opening comments about sleep disorders. And then it can also affect like parts of the body that we don't control, like our blood pressure, for example. So some people get lightheadedness when they stand up as part of Parkinson's disease. And then once it gets to the parts of the brain that control tremor and slowness of movement, after that, it then spreads to parts of the brain that can cause dementia and hallucinations later in the disease course. No one, to my knowledge, has mapped it out in patients because there's no great way of measuring it. You know, we can't look at where the misfolded protein is in patients and follow people over time. So your question is a good research one, but I don't have a good answer for you. Ms. Bowman?
Well, I'm glad you clarified things, and reading your book really helped me. I'm convinced that I got Parkinson's through pesticides, and it was through wine, California wines. Every time I would have a glass of California wine, my sinuses would just explode, and I couldn't breathe. And there was something about that. I thought it was the sulfites, but now I look back at it, I think it was pesticides. Now, when I have European wines, that doesn't bother me.
I don't know. So there's not really good evidence on wine consumption. What there's good evidence is living next to a vineyard. So I don't know how much of the spraying on the vineyards is making their way into the wine itself. So I don't want the California Wine Association coming.
Oh, I'm not going to do that, but yeah.
So I don't know. But I would be most concerned, if I'm a farmer. Second, if I live near those areas and I'm breathing in those pesticides. Or third, I'm drinking well water that's potentially contaminated from those.
But if they spray the vines, it's going to go into the roots, and then the grapes, it's going to be inside the grapes. So we are going to be drinking.
So the guy who's written a lot on this is a guy named Alexis Elbaz. If you Google him, that's who's done this research. I'll put his name in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And what can we do today? I mean, would you please repeat what we can do individually to try to stop these pesticides being sold?
So PD Avengers, www.pdavengers.com. It's the first link I put in there. That's over 1,000 people like you have formed this global grassroots organization, I think from people in 40 different countries, and made their voices heard. We had a red letter campaign in which we asked people to give a dime about Parkinson's, and 30,000 people like you mailed in these postcards to the White House, asking the president to ban Paraquat and trichloroethylene, asking him to make Medicare's coverage of telemedicine permanent, and asking him to increase research funding tenfold for Parkinson's disease. I think those three things would make a huge difference. Listen, when people make their voices heard, change happens. You know, there's been no million-person march on the White House or on Washington, D.C. for Parkinson's disease. There was for HIV, there is for breast cancer. There was a March of Dimes for polio. What's going on with the Parkinson's community? Dr. Smiley?
Dr. Dorsey, just two quick things. One, just by happen chance, I've run into two people. We've had dysentery and constipation for over a year. Doctors just throw up their hands. They don't know what it is. I suspect it is
Dysentery, and what was the second thing?
Constipation.
Oh, well, constipation, I told you a lot about that. Dysentery, I can't link to Parkinson's.
The other thing is, if you get famous and get to the West Coast, show up at Lisa and Steph's show.
I'm sorry, say it again?
I say, you get out west, show up at Lisa and Steph's PD Connect.
I'll be delighted. Lisa, do I have a standing invitation to come out?
I think you would be a great person.
Absolutely.
I'd be delighted. Listen, I'm trying to get the word out. I've done like 20 or maybe 50 of these talks. And listen, it's people like you who know the disease most closely, who still have their wits about them, who some of you guys have resources, some of you have connections, some of you know people who changed the course of these diseases. There are plenty of examples we highlighted in chapter 3 of the book.
Ray?
Yes, sir.
Speaking of connections, not to name drop, but a good friend of ours is Jared Hoffman, our congressman in Marin County. And
yes.
I'm going to reach out to him. You can believe it.
That would be fantastic. I reached out to my congressman and I let him know about it too. So if everyone does, 1.2 million Americans make their voices heard, action will follow. And there is a Congresswoman, Nydia Velázquez, who introduced a bill into Congress to ban paraquat. So there are people, Senator Cory Booker, you know, who went to school at Stanford. I think his father, one of his parents had Parkinson's and a big advocate. So we just need more and more and more and more voices.
And Marin County certainly is an area where we have a concentration of Parkinson's.
Yes, and I'd give you some examples, thoughts on why. Ms. Stern.
I wanted to ask about advocacy. What is the Parkinson Foundation and Michael J. Fox doing in terms of picking up your cry for banning these pesticides?
Answer, Steve.
So what are the foundations doing? The lead foundation in terms of policy work is the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Ted Thompson is the head of that. You can email Ted Thompson and you can tell him that Ray Dorsey said that we should email him with your thoughts and suggestions. I'll probably get into trouble from Ted. But if you make your voices heard, they will act. They got 100,000 signatures for paraquat. That wasn't enough, evidently. But they have paraquat closely in their eyes. They're less work is being done on trichloroethylene, which I think actually might be even more problematic than even paraquat, just because how many people were likely affected by it.
I believe my exposure was to TCE. I painted houses as a child through college, and you use solvents to, oil-based paints.
Yeah, that's what exactly. If you have a story, just shoot me an email at info@endingpd.org. That's how I learn. Other questions? We've gone 8 minutes overtime. You're going to read the book. If you haven't purchased the book, you're going to buy the book. It's always good to get some book sales. All proceeds, authors are donating all their proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. If you read the book, you're going to review the book on Amazon. If you can't afford the book, you're going to email me at info@endingpd.org. Ray, can you please send me a copy of the book and give me your address? 61 people are going to join the PD Avengers. We're going to ban paraquat. We're going to ban TCE. We're going to make telemedicine coverage permanent, and we're going to increase research funding tenfold.
Thank you so much, Ray. A wealth of knowledge and passion. It's wonderful to hear you speak yet again. Lisa and I have heard you several times. And anyway, guys, again, just a reminder, what do we want to do? We want to buy the book or email to get the book. We want to write a review. We want to
let's get this up to 400 guys right here. You gave us a challenge. Let's do this. 5 of you can write the review.
Absolutely. We've already done it. So also participate in research. This is so important. We're ending Parkinson's. That's the idea here. Okay. And there's one other thing I was supposed to say. Oh yeah. And join our high intensity exercise class, which is 6 days a week. You guys, even if you feel like you can't get that high intensity in that day, just being in class is going to help you. And then it's going to get, it's the steps to getting at to that higher intensity. All right. Ray, anything else you want to say? Thank you so much for being here and for answering all of our questions and for going over time. Lisa, anything?
No, we're just so thankful. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Got a lot to do.
Thanks, Ray.
Have a great day, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
You're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.